Welcome. Hi, I'm Mikki, and this is Mikkipedia, where I sit down and chat to doctors, professors, athletes, practitioners, and experts in their fields related to health, nutrition, fitness, and well-being. And I'm delighted that you're here. Hello everyone, welcome to Mikkipedia. I am Mikki, and today on the podcast I speak to Dr. Richard Johnson. He's a physician who specialises in kidney health, metabolic disease, and the impact of fructose on overall metabolic health. So, such a pleasure to talk to Rick. He was such an awesome guy, and we talked all about how he developed his interest in fructose, how fructose impacts blood pressure, and the types of foods and drinks are most detrimental, i.e. do we have to avoid fruit if we are metabolically healthy? The impact that these have on just chronic disease, metabolic health in general. And we also talk about Rick's new book titled Nature Wants Us to Be Fat, and the importance of something which he calls a survival switch, which was a mechanism that kept us alive for thousands of years, but in the modern environment now drives metabolic disease. That might sound super clinical, but Rick does a great job of translating that scientific knowledge into really practical applications and in language that anyone can understand. Dr. Richard Johnson was formerly the chief of the renal division and hypertension at the University of Colorado for 9 years. He's a physician that is trained in internal medicine, infectious disease, and nephrology. Along with having an active clinical practice, he's a widely cited NIH-funded scientist who has lectured in over 40 countries and has authored 3 books: The Sugar Fix, The Fat Switch, and his new book, as I mentioned, Nature Wants Us to Be Fat. Dr. Johnson has a special interest in the role of sugar, and especially fructose and its byproduct, uric acid, in driving metabolic and kidney disorders. I first came across Dr. Rick Johnson's work prior to the FIS conference here in Auckland in 2014, and I had the pleasure of listening to him in person as he came along and spoke at that conference. And he has just been such a driver in this field of metabolic health and just how important uric acid is, which is not often talked about with regards to obesity, chronic disease, and metabolic conditions. We can find Dr. Richard Johnson over on his website, drrichardjohnson.com, which I've got links to in the show notes. And we've also linked to his book, Nature Wants Us to Be Fat, which is available over on Amazon. Highly recommend anyone who is interested in this area to grab a copy of that book. And before we get into the podcast, I'd just like to remind you that the best way that you can support us is jump on your favourite podcast platform, hit subscribe, share with your mates, and get the good word out. That would be amazing. And also, if you are after a sweet deal of protein powder, good green vitality, which is what I take every day if you want to be like me, head over to Newzest, www.newzest.co.nz, and use the code Mikki20, MIKKI20, to get a sweet 20% off your order. That is awesome, team. All right, grab your pens out and take some notes, because you'll want to capture the information that Rick shares in today's podcast.
And if I don't know it, I'll just tell you. But I can, I've been studying uric acid probably longer than just about anyone else, because it's gone on for over 20 years. So, so I have a pretty deep knowledge, but I'm always learning new stuff too. So I'm quite open to new ideas. So.
That is awesome, Rick, because of course, when I was reading your book, there are a number of places where you posit an idea of what the relationship could be with uric acid and fructose in a certain health condition. But I also, of course, noted that you were like, this is the state of the research. We don't have a good understanding of how it might influence human health, but his mechanistic data and hypothesis generating data. Like you were very good at, I think, positing where we were,
what we know and what we don't. Well, I would be very, I'll try to be careful in this podcast to make sure that we know the limits of what we're believing and or interpreting. And I mean, there's the science, and then there's the interpretation, and we do have to be careful. But I do think it's a pretty interesting topic. So.
I absolutely love that, actually. So let's kick off, Rick. So you're an expert in kidney health. That's sort of how you got into the area. Yet, of course, you've got such a deep knowledge in and around metabolic disease and obesity. Of course, they're related. When you got into the field, did you expect that you would end up talking and doing your research on the things which we're going to be talking about today?
No, absolutely not. So my boards are in infectious disease and kidney disease. And so initially I was more interested in inflammation and the role of inflammation in the white cell and kidney damage and, infections and kidney disease. But I follow my curiosity, and and when you make a discovery, and it leads to another question, I will just keep going after that and following my each question until I get to the answer, or at least to try to find that answer. So one thing takes me to another.
Yeah. So when I studied nutrition back in the late 90s, when we talked about fructose, which is a lot of what we're going to be talking about today, it was always in light of the potential benefits of having fructose over glucose because it didn't raise insulin to the same extent or at all, because of course the pathway with which we metabolize it is different. So when you sort of, I suppose, begun your research journey, what was your understanding of fructose and how did that change? What was it that sort of changed that for you?
Well, I never was one of those people who thought fructose was good, but I have to say that I really hadn't been studying fructose, and my interest in fructose began when I realized that it was a carbohydrate that actually could raise uric acid, because I had been raised that and taught that the main way you increase uric acid is through, alcohol and purines being, commonly present in meats and things like that. So I really hadn't been taught that sugar was a cause of gout. But when we were studying uric acid and I was trying to figure out why, what was driving uric acid up in our population, I realized that sugar was a mechanism for raising uric acid, that it was due to the fructose component. And I also realized that sugar was well known as a precipitating cause of gout, going all the way back to Sir William Osler. And so, it was known for a long time. I just that I didn't really know it. And that kind of sparked my interest because, I was finding uric acid was a bad player in conditions like hypertension.
And what is it about fructose or sugar that raises uric acid well above where it should be? First of all, what is uric acid? Let's sort of start there. And what's its sort of role in determining our health?
Yeah, so uric acid is a waste product that's generated from the breakdown of DNA and RNA and ATP. So it's a nitrogen-rich, small chemical compound. And then when it's generated, we have to really get rid of it because we can't really metabolize it very well. There are a lot of animals that can break it down further. They have an enzyme called uricase, but humans lost that enzyme. And so when we make uric acid, it's kind of an end product. It's like the final product from breaking down nucleotides. And so just like we get rid of urea, we have to find ways to get rid of uric acid. And so we excrete it in our kidneys, through our kidneys in the urine, and we excrete it in our gut. And so Most people were thinking of it as a waste product that, when it builds up in your blood, it can create a problem because it's poorly soluble. And so when it crystallizes, if the concentrations get high, it can crystallize. And so, for example, it can cause kidney stones because if the concentrations get high in the urine, especially if the urine becomes acidic, then the crystals really form easily. And so it can form uric acid crystals and kidney stones. And it was originally identified by a guy who was trying to figure out what was the cause of a kidney stone. And then it also can crystallize in the joints. And what it does there, it causes this arthritis, this painful arthritis we know as gout. And so gout's been around for ever. And, we realized that it's from high uric acid, and it was linked years ago with, drinking alcohol, eating a lot of rich foods that contain these purines, and sweet foods. Port wine that has sugar and alcohol is a great way of doing it. And so most people have thought of uric acid as the cause of gout, that it's, increased by certain foods. Because it's excreted by the kidney, it goes up in kidney disease as well. And so, people with kidney disease, and since I'm a kidney doctor, a lot of people with kidney disease have high uric acids, and then they are at risk for gout. And so, so it's thought of as, it's a waste product. But a lot of people were thinking that, well, if the uric acid is high in the blood, the main risk is gout and kidney stones, but there was an association of high uric acid in the blood with, obesity, diabetes, hypertension, kidney disease, and all these different conditions, and, metabolic syndrome. And everyone was saying, well, is it because the uric acid is high because you do have obesity? Maybe people who are obese are eating too much of these rich foods, or people with kidney disease, they're retaining the uric acid because it's excreted by the kidney. High blood pressure, maybe there's an association of the high uric acid with, maybe people with high blood pressure have some problems getting rid of uric acid in their urine as well. And so a lot of people were thinking that the uric acid is high in these conditions as a consequence of these conditions. So, you have a high uric. If you're obese, you tend to have an increased risk for gout. It isn't that gout or high uric acid increases your risk for obesity. It's the reverse. And so this is kind of the way people were thinking. And what happened that made me so interested in this whole topic was we were trying to figure out what was the cause of high blood pressure. And everyone knew that in high blood pressure, there's a problem with the kidneys trying to get rid of salt. So there is a kidney problem. And so if the kidneys are having trouble getting rid of salt, then you start retaining the salt, and it seems to be associated with a rise in blood pressure. And everyone was kind of focusing on hormones and vasoactive factors and, what could be, or genetic causes, but I was wondering if there could be an acquired cause of hypertension, that maybe the kidneys normally could excrete salt pretty well, but over time there's something happened to them that would cause them to not get rid of the salt. And so when I was studying this, I realized that low-grade kidney damage, one that did not make the kidney function test change at all, they were basically the same. But if I created low-grade kidney damage to the kidney, very, very low grade, that the kidneys started to hold on to salt, and the animals would develop salt-sensitive hypertension. And then, so then I go, okay, well, what could cause subtle damage to the kidneys? And there was all this data that uric acid, is high in people with hypertension. And I knew that uric acid could form crystals. And there were some reports that, that patients with gout have uric acid crystals in their kidney itself. So I said, aha, maybe uric acid crystals could be causing that low-grade damage to the kidney that makes you hold on to salt. So we took animals, laboratory animals, they actually, like lab rats, they have this enzyme uricase, so they can degrade uric acid, unlike us. So I said, okay, well, I'm just going to block that enzyme, so raise their uric acid sort of like a human and see what happens. And when we did that, the animals became hypertensive. And I go, oh my God, raising
yeah,
uric acid is raising their blood pressure? How can that be?
yeah,
And then,
yeah.
so that was like 1999 or 2000 when that happened. It was a long time ago. And Marilda Mazzali, who was this Brazilian fellow working with me, she, when she came to me, she said, "You won't believe it. These animals are developing hypertension." And so I didn't believe it. I mean, I was skeptical. And
Yeah.
so I had her do many, many more animals. And it was just incontrovertible. It was these animals were developing hypertension. And so we thought it was the crystals, but when we looked in their kidneys, there were no crystals. So it was working somehow independently of crystals. And that was the beginning. And that was when we realized that soluble uric acid, just high uric acid, could do something that could raise blood pressure. And it was, we started putting uric acid on cells. We could show that it could cause the release of things that could cause constriction of blood vessels. And we realized that this was that, that we had discovered something that was potentially interesting. And at that point, there was a young doctor, Daniel Feig, who came to my office, and he was a pediatrician, and he was studying children with hypertension. And one of the things that we discovered when we were doing our animal studies was that in the very beginning, when we raised the uric acid, these animals developed high blood pressure that we could fix by lowering their uric acid. So it was uric acid dependent. But over time, they started getting the subtle injury to their kidneys. And once that happened, then you could lower the uric acid, and they stayed hypertensive. So it seemed like there was an initiation, and then there was a maintenance. And so the initiation was driven by uric acid, and then the maintenance was driven by low-grade kidney damage that the uric acid did. So when Dan came to my office and he says, "Well, I've got adolescents with hypertension," and I thought to myself, well, this is like the perfect group, because if there's a period of time where you have normal, where the kidneys aren't diseased, this would be the group. And then so their blood pressure should respond if we lower the uric acid. And so the first step was, is their uric acid levels high? And so he said, "Yeah, let me go check." And he came back about 2 months later with over 150 patients where he'd measured the uric acid, and it was a line. The higher the uric acid, the higher the blood pressure. The R value was unbelievably tight. I mean, it was much better than I saw in my rats, and this was human data. So Dan went and got a grant from the NIH to see about lowering the uric acid in these people and see if it could help. And these kids had never, none of them had ever had any kind of medication at all. None of them had ever been on a medicine, period. And we randomized them in a double-blind crossover trial to lower the uric acid. And when we did that, we had an unbelievable finding. In 95% of the 90% plus of those who we lowered the uric acid to under 5, they became normotensive without any other drug. And only 5% of the placebo group did. And we published this in the JAMA, and it was considered one of the top cardiovascular articles of the year way back when. And since then, we've been on this track thinking to ourselves that, oh my gosh, this could be important. And one of the things that was interesting is these kids that were developing hypertension also were overweight, and they had insulin resistance. A lot of them had features of metabolic syndrome, and many of them were eating sugar. And so we started giving sugar to animals, and we could show that they developed hypertension as well. And actually there's data in people that if you give fructose to a person, their blood pressure goes up within 10 minutes. But if you give glucose to a person, it does not. And we went on and did further studies showing this, and we did studies in humans as well. But what we found is that when we gave fructose to animals, that they developed hypertension and metabolic syndrome, and high uric acid. So what we did is we then lowered the uric acid with a drug, And when we did that, their blood pressure came down just as we expected.
Oh, amazing. So, Rick, when Dr. Dan came to you with his children that had hypertension, was that one of the first times that the idea that children could even develop hypertension was sort of out there? Because I remember, again, when I was studying, we talked about type 2 diabetes being adult onset diabetes. We talked about hypertension being like an adult problem. But of course, more and more, we were beginning to get these cases of children developing these metabolic issues. So was it quite widespread, this idea that children could get hypertension, or was this a relatively sort of new understanding?
Well, a long time ago, and I guess you and I both know this, but when I was in training, type 1 diabetes was usually youth onset diabetes, and adult onset diabetes was type 2. And it was thought that type 2 diabetes was associated with obesity and insulin resistance, and it was something that occurred in adults. And type 1 diabetes was this disease where you got lost your insulin production from probably a viral and then an autoimmune reaction in your pancreas. But what's happened is more and more children are developing obesity, and more children are developing type 2 diabetes. And the same thing's true for high blood pressure. So when I was little, when I was in medical school, hypertension in children was usually from kidney damage or some kind of hereditary disease or a tumor like Wilms tumor or something that was causing problems often with the kidney. But nowadays, about half of the children presenting with hypertension have regular essential primary hypertension. And it's usually associated with obesity and metabolic syndrome. And Dan actually did do the study. I should have explained this better, but when Dr. Dan was doing these studies with children, he actually figured out which ones had, a hereditary form or a primary form, or due to a kidney disease or whatever, and those that had essential hypertension. And I'm only talking about the essential hypertension. The uric acid levels were not that high in the kids that had known causes of hypertension, but in the kids with primary or essential hypertension, that's where the uric acid levels were high. And when we did the trial, we only picked children with essential hypertension. And that was the group where lowering uric acid was incredible. And when we did the animals and we gave sugar and we lowered uric acid, we also had that fall in blood pressure. But then we had another big discovery, and that was that not only did blood pressure correct, but we could block weight gain and the rise in triglycerides and the increase in liver fat and all these things that are associated with metabolic syndrome were also improved. And that was like, what? You could what? And then we started realizing, and then when we went back and looked at the trials like that Dan ran, we found that lowering uric acid actually reduced weight gain in those studies too. So it was sort of like, oh my gosh, what do we got going on here? And then we started looking at, not just me, but many people started looking at the relationship of uric acid to high blood pressure and to obesity and all these things. And here's what's really cool, Mikki. You would think, if uric acid goes up as a consequence of obesity or as a consequence of diabetes, then you would expect the diabetes to occur first and then the uric acid to go up. But in all these studies that have been done, if you have a high uric acid, it predicts the development of obesity. It predicts the development of hypertension. It predicts the development of diabetes. And so what happens is we even took people who their only abnormality that we could tell was a high uric acid. They were lean, normal weight, no kidney disease, normal triglycerides, no problem with their blood glucose. They all look normal, but 5 years later, they have a dramatically increased risk for developing all those consequences, obesity, diabetes. So the high uric acid precedes and predicts the development of these conditions. So that sort of started me going, oh my gosh, this is like a complete change in thinking, because everyone was thinking of gout as, and uric acid as being secondary to these things, but could it be important? So that it was at that point that we started saying, well, okay, well, fructose raises uric acid, and how does it do it? And what's interesting is, when fructose gets metabolized, the fructose breaks down, and it breaks down like a calorie. And it's like all things like glucose breaks down. All these guys break down when you break down the amino acids or the proteins into amino acids. And so everything's kind of like nutritionally metabolized. But when you break down fructose, the uric acid doesn't come out of the fructose molecule at all. It's not from that pathway. It's generated as a side chain reaction. And there's a side chain reaction that occurs with fructose that's really unique to fructose. And that is that there's this consumption of ATP. And ATP is, kind of our main type of energy we have in our cells. So our mitochondria make all this ATP, and we use the ATP to drive. It's our energy. It drives what we do. You need ATP to think, talk, walk, run, everything. So ATP is kind of the key. And if you don't have ATP, you're basically dead. I mean, ATP is critical for life. And when we breathe oxygen, the oxygen's used, a lot of it, to help make ATP in the mitochondria. And when we're eating food, we're using it to generate ATP. So ATP is kind of the key thing. But when you metabolize food, when you burn food, you do use some energy to make energy. But what happens with fructose is it consumes ATP very, very quickly, because the enzyme that breaks fructose down is completely unregulated and works very fast. So when it sees fructose, it drops ATP like that. And so unlike glucose or other nutrients, the ATP levels drop in the cell very acutely with like a soft drink or anything, and it's been shown in people. And then when that ATP level falls, what's interesting is there's a series of reactions that is peculiar to this fructose that leads to a persistent low ATP level. And the way it works is there's a drop in ATP and phosphate, and that stimulates an enzyme that sweeps away the degradation of ATP products so that they can't be regenerated to ATP. So there's a substance called AMP that normally gets regenerated to ATP, but it's removed to make uric acid. So the uric acid is part of this sweeping system that removes, as ATP is degraded, it's kind of removed to make uric acid. And then the uric acid causes a stress to the mitochondria. It's a type of oxidative stress. And that when that happens, it drops the ability of the mitochondria to produce energy. So mitochondria make less ATP. And so now you've consumed ATP, you're not regenerating it as fast, and you're also blocking the production of ATP. And there's a few other ways it works too. So it's like hits it 5 or 6 ways, and the net effect is that the ATP levels stay low in the cell. And when that happens, the energy that you're eating, instead of going to make ATP, is now being shunted to stored energy. And basically ATP is your immediate energy. And guess what your stored energy is? Fat.
Adipose fat. Yeah. So, Rick, does that mean that when we have fructose alongside the other nutrients, the other nutrients are more likely to be stored because of the consequence of fructose has at that time? So if you have a soda with a burger, for example, you're more likely to store the burger energy because of the unique effects of fructose.
Absolutely. So that's exactly how it works. So the fructose changes the cell so that it activates, so that any food that comes in gets preferentially turned into fat. Whenever it can. Yeah. So anything that would normally be used to make ATP, there's a shunt. It actually shunts that energy. It's like, so the more you eat, the more fat you'll generate. if you've activated this, if the ATP levels are low. And so this, you've called it, Mikki, because this is why high fat foods can be bad. So there's this huge controversy in the literature. Is high fat good or bad? And but the way it works is that the fructose drops the energy in the cell, and then whatever you eat gets turned into fat. And if you eat a high fat diet with the fructose, it's much more effective at generating a lot of fat, because 1 teaspoon of fat has twice the number of calories as a teaspoon of carbs. Yeah. And so in America, where there's a lot of fatty foods, fats in a lot of foods, the fructose is kind of like the fire that sets off this switch to store fat. And then you eat high fat diets and you gain weight incredibly fast. So if I take an animal and I give it sugar, it's hungry because it's activated the switch. The energy levels are low. It's hungry. It wants to gain weight. But if you just give it carbs, it won't gain weight that fast because it's not calorie dense. But if you give them sugar and high fat, now they've got the fuel. They've set off the fire. Now they got the fuel to make a super big bonfire. So they gain fat really, really fast. So like if you're in Japan and you activate the switch by eating sugar or whatever, there are other ways to activate it. And then what happens is you don't have the high fat food. You'll get the metabolic syndrome, but you won't have this massive obesity. Instead, they'll have a small belly, but they still are insulin resistant, diabetic, fatty liver, and so forth. So that's why that's the case. And it also explains this really interesting thing that if you're on a low carb diet, and a lot of your listeners I think are probably on low carb diets, and if you're on a low carb diet, you're not getting the dietary sugars, you're not eating sugar, so you're not activating the switch very well. And so now you're on a high fat diet and you're not going to gain weight because it's calories, but you know how to regulate it.
Yeah, it's so interesting, Rick. So a couple of thoughts. So when we talk about just a high carb diet and the impact like just eating carbohydrate can have on blood sugar levels and blood sugar regulation, of that sort of spike in glucose and then it drops as insulin sort of stores away nutrients, like a lot of the energy crash that people experience, we often only refer to it as a blood sugar regulation issue, but potentially it might also be an ATP generation issue. Do you think, like from immediate energy perspective?
Yeah, so here's the thing. So, when I first, when we discovered that fructose was bad, it was around 2006. And my technician and there was several people, but one of them, the one I'm thinking about most, is an MD doctor who was working with me, and he had a son who had developed really bad fatty liver, and we were finding that fructose was causing fatty liver, and we thought it was through this uric acid mechanism. So we found out that he was drinking a lot of soft drinks. So we had him just stop his soft drinks. And 2 months later, his fatty liver was resolved by ultrasound. Unbelievable. So my friend said to me, Rick, why don't you write a book? Because you've got enough data that fructose is the culprit. And at that point, as you were saying, a lot of people were thinking fructose was good. So I wrote a book called The Sugar Fix, 2008. It was the first book that promoted a low fructose diet. And I had all these people calling me and saying, this is amazing. I'm losing weight. I'm still able to eat a lot of foods. I'm just kind of avoiding sugar. And wow, you're in high fructose corn syrup. And wow, this is great. But then I had a few people say, Dr. Johnson, I find that I can't get rid of my weight by just dropping sugar. I have to reduce bread and rice and potatoes. And I thought to myself, there are a lot of people, it does seem like bread is fattening to me, even for me. I was thinking, I don't seem to do well eating a lot of bread and potatoes and stuff. So then Miguel and Aspa, another doctor working with me, we were talking about it one day, and he said, the body can make fructose, and I was aware of this, but there is this one chemical set of reactions where you can make fructose, and you make it from glucose, and what has to happen is that you have to have it doesn't make it from glucose at normal glucose concentrations, but when glucose goes up, like in diabetes, then you can start making fructose. And it had already been shown that people with diabetes have high fructose levels in their blood, even when they are not eating fructose. And so, it was known that there was some production of fructose going on. So then we got this crazy idea. Maybe what happens when you eat bread and carbs, and the ones that are high glycemic carbs might actually, when you eat them, although it's not diabetes, but your glucose goes up, but only for a short while. So we don't call it diabetes, we call it transient hyperglycemia, transient rises in glucose. But would that be enough to trigger the production of fructose? So what we did is we gave animals high glucose we put glucose in their drinking water. And, according to the Johnson hypothesis, we were not going to see obesity. But now we were thinking we might. But it was unbelievable. The animals actually did become fat. They became diabetic. They became all the features of metabolic syndrome. And then what we did is we gave the glucose to animals that could not break down fructose. So they could still produce insulin and all that. And when we did that, we found that when we gave glucose to animals and they got to metabolic syndrome, their fructose levels were high in their blood and in their liver. And we found that when we blocked fructose metabolism, we could really have a dramatic effect on obesity, insulin resistance, fatty liver. I mean, it didn't completely block it, but it was very, very significant. And then we go, oh, wow. It isn't just that when you eat high glycemic carbs, you're stimulating insulin, and insulin's making you fat. Really, it's the fact that the glucose is being converted to fructose in your body. And recently, a group just published a study showing that you can make the equivalent of a whole soft drink, a can of Coke, in terms of the fructose. We make that in our bodies when we eat, high glycemic foods. So we're making fructose, and we can make a lot of fructose. And it's probably how these high glycemic carbs are working. And so, boom, it's not just sugar.
Yeah. So, Rick, what sort of quantity would someone need to consume at any one time to have these deleterious effects? Or is it cumulative over time? And I guess I asked that question because a lot of the research studies look like high quantities of fructose. And some of the critique I hear is people don't eat that in real life. So, what are the considerations that you think of there?
Well, there's several layers to your question. So the very first one is that it's all about the concentration of fructose that's seen by the liver. And we actually figured out that it was really the liver where that's kind of the site where everything happens. A lot of it happens there. There's also the brain too, but the livers are really major sites. So when you eat fructose, first of all, you have to absorb it through the intestine, and then it has to get to the liver. So it turns out the intestine can kind of eliminate like 4 or 5 grams of fructose, and it just eliminates it, turns it to glucose, and that's it. So there's no danger. For example, if you eat a single fruit that has like 4 or 5 grams of fructose, there's no problem because the intestine will deactivate it. It's really when you eat like a dessert, a soft drink where you're taking a large amount of fructose in a short period of time, that you can overwhelm the intestine and then it gets to the liver where you activate this switch. You can also activate the switch with high glycemic carbs, and there you can do it just by raising the glucose in your liver and blood. But it can really vary how you do it. So, for example, if you use a continuous glucose monitor, you can measure your glucose. And if you eat a slice of bread, some people's glucose will go up a lot and some won't go up much at all because there's individual variation. And obviously the people where it goes up a lot, those are the ones at risk of producing the most fructose. But here's another trick. Even in a person who is sensitive, if you put things like avocado on the bread, you can largely block that rise in glucose. So then you can eat the bread and probably not as much of it's going to be converted to fructose. So it's a little bit about how you eat it. And here's another one. If you give a soft drink in 5 minutes, the concentration of fructose is huge. And we did this with apple juice, and it just floods the liver and you get this big activation of the switch. And we did this in people. But if you give the apple juice over an hour, it kind of trickles into the liver and you get a much milder activation of the switch. So it's not just about the amount, it's about the concentration. It's how you eat it. It's whether or not you mix it with other foods, if it's got fiber. So there's all these different factors. But you also raised the question of what was brought up in the literature. And in the literature, a lot of the high fructose corn syrup industry will say, hey, in order to create metabolic syndrome in a mouse or a rat, you have to give it like 60% of its food as fructose. And that's not realistic. That's not what we see in people. And it's true that if you put fructose in the food for a mouse, you have to give like 50%, 60% of the food as sugar or fructose to really get the effect, okay? But remember that the mouse and the rat, they have an enzyme called uricase. And that enzyme keeps their uric acid levels really low. So their uric acid levels are low. And when they eat fructose, that low uric acid goes up a little bit and triggers the switch. But it takes a lot of fructose to really activate it like big time so that they get obese in just a few weeks. Cool. So humans had a mutation in uric acid metabolism. So we lost that enzyme uricase millions of years ago. And so we have higher uric acids. And when we eat fructose, we get a big bump in our uric acid levels. And so the way we proved that this was the mechanism is we took normal animals and we inhibited their uricase. And when we did, then even small amounts of fructose were able to induce the metabolic syndrome. And also the whole works, fatty liver, insulin resistance. So you could make an animal very sensitive to fructose if you inhibited uricase. And then I was really lucky, Mikki. I ran into this guy who is a scientist, wonderful man, Eric Gaucher, who was able to resurrect the extinct uricase gene. And when we did that, we could actually do really cool studies where we were able to show that the uricase that our ancestors had actually reduced our ability to make fat from sugar, fructose. But when we lost that gene, we became much more sensitive. So we actually were able to prove it, elegantly by resurrecting the actual enzyme. So I feel very comfortable in saying to you that humans are extremely sensitive to sugar. We had a mutation that occurred 15 million years ago that made us very sensitive to fructose. And that's why, the high fructose corn syrup companies, when they say, hey, it's not fair to compare, the rat has to eat so much. Yes, the rat does have to eat so much, but I can make the rat eat a lot less if we do the same thing to it that happened to us. So I hope that helps answer that. And, and then I'll just kind of tell you, it was kind of one of the more fun stories in my career is when I realized that this mutation occurred and that it made us more sensitive to the effects of sugar. It really raised the question, why did the mutation occur? And I started reading about it, and it occurred during a time when our ancestors almost went extinct. There was this global cooling that occurred 15 million years ago that wiped out 70% of all species, 30% of all species. And our ancestors were almost one of the ones that didn't make it. And there's a world expert on those ancestors. His name's Peter Andrews. He's at the Museum of Natural History in London. And I tracked him down.
Yeah.
And I reached out to him. I flew to London. I met with him at the museum. And we had a wonderful discussions, and we ended up writing some papers together because the mutation occurred right then at a time when these apes were starving. And he actually had evidence that these ancestral apes were starving. They get these like rings around on their teeth that of enamel hypoplasia, they call it, but it's basically from seasonal starvation. What happened was, as it got cooler, they didn't have any food for the winter, and they were starving during the winter. And so they had to activate their switch stronger. And the way they could do that was to mutate that uricase. And when that happened, I mean, it happened probably by accident, of course, but when it happened, it was natural selection advantage. And that's why all humans, as well as the great apes, we all have the same mutation. We cannot, we have higher uric acid levels. And so we're more sensitive to the effects of sugar.
Yeah.
So the obesity epidemic, the diabetes epidemic is partly due to the fact that we're eating so much bad, we have so much access to sugar and high glycemic carbs, but it's also because of a genetic mutation that occurred 15 million years ago.
Yeah, and in fact, I remember reading that about uricase when I was doing some teaching for students, talking about things that occur in the past that occur from a advantageous perspective, as you say, survival selection, but now sort of work against us in terms of our health. Rick, you mentioned the rats and the, feeding them particular diets, and actually you didn't mention this, but this is what I thought of when you were talking about rats fed a high-fat diet or people on high-fat diets. What I've seen in the literature is that when they are comparing rodent models of diets and use a high-fat diet, they're often using a type of chow that is high fat, but also actually high sugar. And
right.
Yeah, so the standard, it's sort of
so
like
so we did a study on this actually. So for example, we fed, when they say high fat diet, often it's high fat, high sugar. And so we wanted to know what happens when you just give a high fat diet with no sugar, no fructose.
Yeah.
And we gave animals a lard diet, and they didn't get fat at all. They did not gain weight.
Yeah,
but then we gave fructose to make them hungry. It induces a thing called leptin resistance. So normally leptin is this hormone that tells you when to stop eating. And when you give fructose to animals, they become resistant to leptin. So normally, the way you can prove it is you take an animal and you inject it with leptin. If you inject an animal with leptin, they're going to reduce their food intake by 50% for the next 24 hours. But if they're leptin resistant, they'll just keep eating. And when you give fructose, initially they're leptin sensitive, but after a while, it takes a few weeks to a month or so. But then they become resistant to the effects of leptin. And then when you give them leptin, they just keep eating. So once the animal becomes leptin resistant, then when you give it lard, they become fat very, very quickly. In fact, we did this really cool study where we first gave fructose to make them leptin resistant. And then we removed the fructose, and now we gave them the lard, and then they gained the weight. So you didn't even have to have the fructose around to make them gain weight once they're leptin resistant. The leptin resistance just was enough to keep driving weight gain because they couldn't control their appetite.
Yeah.
But, that goes away after a few weeks. If you go off fructose after 2 or 3 weeks, you start regaining your ability to regulate your appetite. And when we realized that, I had this insight too, because the great thing about like the low carb diets and the old Atkins diet is that there's an initial 2-week period where it's really stringent and you can't eat really much carbs at all. And it's during that 2-week, I call it rebooting, because it allows that leptin resistance to go away. And it also decreases, the more sugar you eat, the more you absorb it because it turns on the transporters. And it takes about 2 weeks to turn that down too. So it's really a great system. This low carb diet is a very effective way to to turn off your sensitivity to sugar, and even things like craving of sugar starts to go down with following a 2-week carb restriction. So that this kind of rebooting every now and then is probably a really good idea.
Yeah. I'm just thinking about gout actually right now. So for someone who experiences painful gout, that arthritic condition, and they've been told to stay off alcohol, stay off meat, and potentially to stay off sugar, I believe that they're being told that now. I don't think that was always the case. Would they benefit from going lower carbohydrate in general?
Yeah. By the way, I love the way you're thinking, Mikki. You're really quite a deep thinker here. So I love it. I absolutely love it. And all these questions you're giving are just so insightful. So I would love, so honestly, I have chapters on all this in my book.
Yes.
Nature Wants Us to Be Fat. But I can kind of give you the lowdown. For sure, the principal drivers of gout are sugar, high fructose corn syrup, sugars, soft drinks. There's a lot of people who cakes. A lot of people will tell you that if they eat sweet food, they can feel that twinge of gout. But you can also get it from really high purine foods. And it turns out, here's a really interesting thing. It turns out we have a receptor for the purine foods, a taste bud. So there's 5 tastes. There's sweet, and sweet is really to help find foods that have sugar and fructose that will help you store fat. This was a evolutionary desire to be able to make sure that you can find foods that can help you when food shortage is pending. So sweet. Salt turns out to be a really interesting one too. It's something that we desire, and we can talk about that in a bit, and it's involved with the switch as well. And then there's bitter and sour, which really we're taught to try to teach us not to eat foods that might be poisonous or toxic. But then there's a 5th taste, and that taste is called umami.
It's delicious.
And umami is a delicious flavor. I love umami foods. Its nickname is savory, and umami is actually a Japanese name, as you can tell. And it turned out that umami is from a flavor from a specific amino acid called glutamate, and it's enhanced like tenfold by nucleotides, and the specific ones are IMP and AMP. Now, it turns out that IMP and AMP are directly in line with this energy depletion pathway. And surprise, surprise, if you give IMP or AMP to animals, they get obese and develop metabolic syndromes. But here's what's amazing. Glutamate also gets converted to uric acid in the body. And we actually can show that glutamate can cause obesity in animals, and you can block it by blocking uric acid. And it turns out that the foods rich in glutamate and IMP and AMP, these are exactly the same foods that we say are rich in purines. So it probably turns out that this taste bud was really to identify foods that might help us raise our uric acid.
Oh, interesting.
And so there's an actual link. Now, here's the good news, because I know you, Mikki, you just said it. I love umami. Yeah. And I love umami. And the fantastic bit of good news, because most of this sounds bad, right? But, it's all about dose and concentration. So when you eat sugar, the average person's eating 70 grams of sugar a day. But the average person's only eating like 4 or 5 grams of glutamate a day, if that. Yeah. So even though on a gram for gram basis, umami, 1 gram of glutamate is worse than 1 gram of sugar, we're not eating that much umami. Yeah. So it turns out that it's a minor player in driving obesity. Yeah. And it's also, but it's a modest player in driving uric. I mean, it can drive up gout for sure, but you really have to have a fairly significant meal. So it turns out that beer has the most umami of all because the yeast extract is just very a lot of nucleotides, and so when you drink beer, you're getting a big dose. It's sort of like a soft drink because the alcohol also breaks down into uric acid. And so it turns out that beer is a great way to precipitate gout, and it's a great way to activate the switch as well. So it's like a soft drink. So at the beer belly, there are these people who love beer. They tend to get a little abdominal obesity. They get hypertensive. They get fatty liver. Their triglycerides go up. Guess what? That's the metabolic syndrome.
Yeah.
We need to just recognize that it's the same thing. But anyway, you can also get from some foods like shrimp. If you eat a lot of shrimp or caviar or really rich shellfish, mussels, crab, these kinds of foods can also raise uric acid and probably can cause obesity if you eat a lot of them independently of sugar. But most umami foods, like there's a little bit in blue cheese and gorgonzola and Caesar salads, and you're not going to get that much umami from there to really activate the switch very much. If you ate a Caesar salad at every meal and, with anchovies, well, it might get you. but in general, sugar is a really powerful way to do it. Beer is a powerful way to do it. Processed red meats, not so much natural red meats, but processed red meats tend to raise uric acid a bit because the processing releases the glutamates and can make it very flavorful. But anyway, so bottom line is the best way, if you have gout, what do? Well, you drink a lot of water. You try to reduce your sugar. You should reduce your salt too, and we can talk about that. But you should reduce your salt. There's a very strong association of gout with hypertension, and so reduce sugar and salt. Drink a lot, and vegetables that are not high glycemic. Almost all vegetables are good. Just avoid or reduce. You can't avoid, but reduce your intake of potatoes, rice, cereals, bread, and sugar. Okay. Those are like the big five.
Yeah. No, that's great.
Yeah.
So, Rick, for people who aren't suffering from or don't have gout, then would they just therefore make a decision to either drink the beer or have the processed meat and don't do it in one meal? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. If you want to stay healthy, then the question is, there's so many foods that can activate the switch. Do we ever allow ourselves to drink a beer or to have a piece of chocolate cake? And, the reality is that if you're activating the switch all the time, you are definitely going to get obese. But if you recognize that, the average person who's obese is the average person is eating like 70 grams of sugar a day. It doesn't mean that you can't eat 10 or 15 grams of sugar a day. That's going to cause much less activation of the switch than if you're eating 100 grams a day. Yeah. And so there's a bit of wisdom that we need to apply to a healthy living. So I don't know, Mikki, do you have children?
I'm a stepmom. Yeah. One of them is a great eater, like very healthy. She's, at uni though, so she's a uni student. And the other one, Pop-Tarts, Frosties.
There you go. But like on birthdays, will you have a slice of birthday cake?
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, of course. So, it's the same thing. We shouldn't be so stringent that we completely eliminate sugar or things like this. You can do it, but, we do have the taste buds for it. And, our species does like it. But, we need to do is, like if you have a weight problem, it really makes sense to try to avoid sugar if you can.
Yeah.
And a low carb diet is a good way to approach it. Intermittent fasting is a great way to approach it. But we only live once, so we need to keep in mind what healthy nutrition and decide for ourselves, how much you're going to allow yourself to eat of these foods.
Yeah.
So I love shrimp. I love lobster. I'll eat them occasionally for sure. I know that if I eat a lot of them, it's maybe not so good for me. So, I try to not overdo it.
Yeah.
But I think that's, in my book, I go through what I think is a very healthy diet for people who are in balance. And then I also have a separate diet for those who are overweight and how to lose the weight. And one of the big things that I've learned, and kind of came out of that study with the uric acid and blood pressure, we found that there was something that could make uric acid raise the blood pressure, but then the kidney damage caused the high blood pressure to persist. And the same thing kind of goes with diabetes. Initially, there's something that makes you resistant to insulin, but over time, we start seeing damage to the islets themselves that make insulin, and then you become permanently diabetic. And there's now data suggesting that this is also true in obesity, that initially, this switch, which I believe it's the switch, makes you obese. But over time, then the mitochondria get damaged. And once they get damaged, then it's very hard to lose weight, even if you stop activating the switch.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I've been really interested in, and I talk a lot about in the book, is the techniques for actually rejuvenating the mitochondria and the techniques for reversing some of the secondary damage that occurs after activation of the switch. And so what you want to do is you want to block the activation of the switch, but you also want to stimulate the recovery. And I think that doing that double approach, it's possible to cure obesity. I believe we can cure obesity, and that it's possible to reverse early diabetes, which we already know we can do. And it's sort of is using these techniques. And one of the most important ones is exercise.
Yeah.
And it's not that you're exercising to lose weight. You have to exercise a huge amount to burn, a lot of calories. And so when we're exercising, what we're really doing is we're trying to condition our mitochondria. And certain types of exercise can actually make the mitochondria grow back. And so, like, if you knock down because you've been overweight, let's say you're listening to this podcast and you're going, oh my God, Dr. Johnson says that once I've been obese for 10 years, I'm not going to be able to get my weight back and eat normally again. I think that you can.
Yeah.
And the trick is to regenerate those mitochondria. The easiest way is to exercise a little, 40 minutes 3 times a week.
Yeah.
And to do what we call zone 2 exercise, where you try to raise your heart rate up to the point where you're not accumulating lactic acid. So if you don't measure the lactic acid yourself, then what you want to do is you want to just be exercising enough so that you can still talk to the person next to you, but it's a little bit difficult. That puts you right in that zone 2. And when you do that, you'll start rebuilding your mitochondria. You can also do it other ways, like green tea.
Yeah.
Can stimulate mitochondria. Dark chocolate can do that. Vitamin C, and even things like intermittent fasting and low carb diets, they can actually have some benefits too.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of ways to do it. But I think most of us who, if we're struggling with weight, this is something we have to consider doing, is not just picking the right foods, but trying to get our energy levels back and get those ATP levels up in our body. And once that happens, if you have really good mitochondria, then suddenly you can eat much more food than you could before without gaining weight.
Yeah. I love that, Rick, because it really helps sort of connect those cellular processes that occur when someone's struggling with regards to their weight, and how you can actually change your physiology to help become more resilient in this food environment. Because let's face it, the food environment is rubbish.
Exactly. Probably one of the simplest things we can do to help people is is to try to reduce the amount of food you eat that's from processed foods, or at least learn to read the labels, because a lot of times they're injecting sugar and salt and all kinds of bad things into the food, and there's often high salt and high sugar content, high fructose corn syrup content in the foods.
Rick, what about cold thermogenesis? Would you do that for your mitochondria?
Yeah. Okay. So there's another way to help burn fat, and that is by doing things where you try to make the mitochondria less efficient, or where they, instead of making ATP, they do this thing where they produce heat. And when you go into the cold, the mitochondria you can do these things where you can try to get the mitochondria to what we call uncouple, where instead of making ATP, they start making heat. And it was shown a long time ago that there were mutations that occurred in the early adventurers that crossed the Bering Strait, the Native Americans, and that a lot of them developed mutations where they could generate heat more, and that might have helped them survive when they crossed the Bering Strait. But now, when they're living in hot environments, that may increase their risk for heat-associated complications. So there's sort of, there is this natural thing where people vary in how much heat they generate in response to things like cold. But this cold, thermogenesis is a means for trying to burn energy or convert energy to heat. It's a way, theoretically, that you could lose weight. Because it will block the storing of energy because you're going to convert it to heat. I think it's another technique, and it probably does work. I think that in some respects, it's better to block the process of storing energy as opposed to generating heat, just because I worry. When the medications first came out in the early 1920s, they had a medicine that did this. But there were a number of deaths from people developing super high fevers with the medication. And so I'm not a big fan. I was using this medicine a few years ago to study how body temperature can affect kidney damage, and there's a lot of people working out in the heat, and so I gave some of these uncoupling agents to animals that were effectively working in the heat, and I made their kidney disease a lot worse.
Oh, interesting.
So, in general, I'm not sure that drugs that do this would be so good. I do think, cold-induced thermogenesis, like jumping in an ice bath and things like that, probably work a little bit, and they turn on this brown fat, that helps to uncouple the energy. But in general, I think there are better ways to do it.
Like the ones that you describe in your book.
Yeah, honestly, it's better because it doesn't come with those complications.
Yeah. No, that's great. Rick, a couple of things I want to chat about. I'm mindful of your time, but one is the form with which fructose is delivered. So, and in New Zealand, we have soft drinks which don't have high fructose corn syrup, but they have sucrose, which the chemical makeup of them isn't actually that different, is it?
Yeah, so we can talk about that just for a minute. So high fructose corn syrup is a mixture of fructose and glucose together. So you just take liquid fructose and you take liquid glucose and you mix them together in different ratios. And sucrose, though, is one molecule that consists of a fructose and a glucose that are bound together. So with table sugar, it's always half of it is fructose and half of it is glucose. Now, one thing about fructose is that when you give it alone, the absorption is a little bit variable, but the absorption's enhanced with glucose. So both sucrose and high fructose corn syrup are more potent than fructose alone. So the glucose helps the fructose get absorbed. Plus, as we talked earlier, the glucose gets converted to fructose too.
Yes.
So the sugar in high fructose corn syrup are more potent than fructose alone for all those different reasons. So that's one thing. So now, when it comes to the two of them, My friend Michael Gorin has shown, and he has a book called Sugar Proof, which is a great book. But he has shown that although the soft drink industry says that when they use high fructose corn syrup, they're putting 55% fructose and 45% glucose in a drink, that often when you buy a fountain drink, it's like 65% fructose and 35% glucose. So what's happening is that when you can mix it, it's very easy to increase the ratio, so forth, because you're mixing it. And so when we did a clinical study where we gave a soft drink that just had sucrose in it, and we compared it to a soft drink that contained fructose or high fructose corn syrup, but it was the classic 55-45. And when we gave it, we got a higher fructose blood level with the high fructose corn syrup because there was a little more fructose in it. And the blood pressure was higher in the people, and the uric acid was higher. So even though there was only a 5% difference, 55 versus, sucrose is 50-50, we found that the high fructose corn syrup, had a little more fructose and was a little worse. But then we wanted to know what happens if you just give fructose and glucose mixed together in a 50-50 ratio. So it's the same thing as sucrose, except it's not bound. And our theory was that when we gave the two where they weren't bound together, that the absorption might be faster. And remember how we talked about how fatty liver is driven by the concentration of fructose?
Yeah.
And so when we fed the animals the exact same amount of fructose, but one got it as free fructose and free glucose, like high fructose corn syrup, and the other one got sucrose, the ones that got the free fructose and free glucose got much more fatty liver. So, they probably had a higher concentration of fructose in their liver, and that explains it because, the sucrose has to be broken down in the gut first, and then the fructose and glucose are absorbed. So there are differences. I truly believe high fructose corn syrup is worse than sugar if you have the choice between the two. But on the other hand, they're both are very potent at activating the metabolic switch, this metabolic syndrome. It's induced by this biologic switch. So I would kind of view them equivalently bad, but it is true. High fructose corn syrup really is probably is a little bit more capable of inducing obesity and fatty liver than sugar.
Yeah. And it's, in your book, you're so good at delineating between food sources of fructose, so and drinks, for example. So the dried fruit and the fruit juice, ideally we would minimize these in our diet compared to, say, whole fruit and things like that. I really love
there's
how you did that.
huge difference. There's a huge difference. And I also have tables on the types of fruits and which ones are healthier than other ones.
Yeah.
But in general, we did a study, natural fruits alone. You don't get that much fructose with natural fruits alone. And especially if you only eat like one or two fruit, and they have fiber and vitamin C and a lot of really good things that help counter it. But when you make fruit juice, you're getting all these fruits together. So now you get a big load of fructose. And dried fruit, unfortunately, gets rid of a lot of the good stuff, but leaves the sugar behind. That's why it tastes so good. But it's just not the, if you're going to go mountain climbing and it's your gorp where you got nuts and a little bit of dried fruit, that's probably good for, when you're out there, exercising intensely for hours.
That's true, yes. You call it gorp.
But
we call it scroggin here in New Zealand, but
scroggin.
Yeah.
And
what is gorp? Great outdoor something or other. I can't remember.
I don't know, but it's it's got little M&Ms and peanuts and raisins and it's got a lot of sugar in it. I would not recommend it. Well, to eat gorp while you're watching TV.
No.
Okay. But if you're up hiking the mountains then it's fine.
Yeah. And in fact, I was just flying back from Australia yesterday, and they bring around the for the people who order the meals, you've got your meals and they've got the drinks carts, and I was just seeing all these people sitting down to big paninis, which are, big bread sort of rolls, with apple juice and orange juice. And I mean, if there was anything that clinically I wish would just like be removed from the food sort of system, it would be juice and soft drinks, actually.
Yeah, apple juice is pretty high in sugar. It really is.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, try to avoid it if you can.
And in fact, carrot juice and beetroot juice, equally, I've seen 50 grams of sugar in just natural sort of juices. So I think that's a real area,
great point.
Where people sort of go wrong. Finally, Rick, you've mentioned salt a number of times. I'm a massive lover of salt. Can you talk to me about the relationship between salt and uric acid and what we need to consider there?
Yes. Okay. So very quickly, so it turns out that salt is another way you can activate the biologic switch. It's just a crazy thing. But when you eat salt, the concentration of salt initially goes up in your blood. And that's why you get thirsty when you eat salty food. When the salt concentration goes up in the blood, it triggers the enzyme that converts glucose to fructose. So the enzyme gets activated. Now, if you're eating carbs at the time, especially a lot of carbs, when you activate that enzyme, then the carbs can be converted to fructose easier. So if you're eating salt on potatoes like French fries, the salt actually helps activate the enzyme to convert those potatoes to fructose. So salted French fries are going to be more dangerous than unsalted fries because the salt kind of gives a double whammy along with the elevation in glucose that it comes from eating the potato. So the elevation in glucose will trigger the switch to make fructose, but the salt accelerates it. So now if you're on a low carb diet or you're not eating a lot of high glycemic carbs, you're not eating bread, rice, and potatoes or not so much, and then you eat salt on a low carb, then there's not as much glucose around to be converted to fructose. So like if you're on a low carb diet, salt is not likely to make you fat because you don't have the glucose to convert to fructose. So, a low carb diet kind of protects you from the effects of salt, just as it protects you from the effects of high glycemic carbs.
Yeah.
But salt can do it. When we give salt to animals, it takes a lot longer for them to become fat. It's not immediate. So if I give sugar, they become fat in a month or 2 months. If I give them high glutamate foods, they'll get fat in a couple months. But if I give them salty foods, it takes like 4 or 5 months. It's a longer process. But they get fat and diabetic on high salty foods, and people who are overweight tend to be on high salt diets.
Yeah.
And so the salt is probably a catalyst to help them convert glucose and carbs to fructose. And in the wild, there are a lot of animals that seek out salt, and it's actually sodium chloride that they seek out, and they'll find these what we call salt licks. Do you call them salt licks? Yeah. So and then like deer will lick the salt, and there's some data showing that when those animals, when they do that, it actually helps them gain weight. And there's even some places, I believe there's a place in New Zealand actually, where they reported that if you give a little bit of salt, for example, to cattle or something, you can increase it can increase the productivity or the amount of fat that the cattle get.
Oh, amazing.
So my belief is that this is another mechanism. When we give salt to an animal, though, even though we're activating the switch, we don't see a rise in uric acid in the blood. But when we look in the liver, we do see that rise in uric acid. So it seems to be more specifically going on in the liver rather than the rest of the body.
Okay. And so, Rick, you make me feel a little bit disappointed, to be honest. Not you, but the mechanism does, because I do enjoy French fries with beer. Post our conversation, though, now I'm like, it's like one of my favorite things to eat, and I'm just doing myself a big double whammy. So my question
Well,
is,
you're pretty skinny, so you must be doing some other things to keep yourself. I mean, are you're either not drinking beer and eating French fries as much as you're telling me, or you have either some exercise regimen or something that you're doing that's keeping you really healthy. What is it? I'm curious.
yeah, actually, in fact, it will be that I'm not eating French fries every day, probably once a week with my beer. And the amounts I have are probably the equivalent of, well, I like a craft beer, Rick, and they tend to be higher in alcohol. So maybe I'm having 1.5 to 2 beers at the time. However, if I was to exercise and deplete my glycogen stores, does that change that switch? So if I'm then consuming potatoes, is that carbohydrate actually then going to be stored as glycogen, or does that not override the switch?
Oh yeah, so a lot of the carbs will. So it isn't like the glucose is only going to fructose. The glucose is also going to glycogen. So like if you're a big athlete, a lot of athletes will glucose load before running a marathon or things like that. Biking or something. And the reason is they want to have a good glycogen store in their liver and especially in their muscle. There's some benefits to glucose loading if you're like an athlete. And so the potatoes would help that. The salt on it though would kind of try to get some of that glucose turned to fructose. But, remember it was a survival pathway. So like if you're really skinny, it's going to be helping put a little bit of fat stores on you, which is supposed to be good. So it's all about the amount, who you are, what kind of exercise you're doing, how often you're eating it. But yeah.
No, that's great. That's awesome, Rick. And do you know, I absolutely loved your book. I felt that, you're, as a scientist, I always think scientists and doctors sort of run the risk of writing things in language that people don't quite understand, but you do such an amazing job of translating what you've learned over the last 20 years. And that's just in this particular book, because I know obviously you've got the fat switch and your other books, but you do a great job of being able to translate it into language we understand, but you also give some really clear guidelines. And that is what I love about it. It's a really practical resource as well. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Mikki. That's just great, really kind words of you. Yeah, I had a very good editor who helped me too, and she would say, can you explain this a little bit more? Or sometimes explain this a little bit less. But
Brilliant.
But it's wonderful having good editors and people who are giving me nice feedback on how to try to explain a complicated subject in a understandable way.
Yeah, well, you've done a great job, and as I said, I've seen you present and you do equally a great job there. Rick, thank you so much for your time this morning, or this afternoon for you. Where can people find out more about how to get your book?
Okay, well, I do have a website. It's called drrichardjohnson.com. I do have, my book is available through all the regular bookstores, and I do know that you can find it in New Zealand, Amazon, other book venues, but those are the main ones. I have an Instagram account and a Twitter account, Dr. Richard J. Johnson is my Instagram, for example.
Awesome. That's fantastic. Thank you, Rick, for your time, and really look forward to seeing an opportunity, if there's one in the future, to see you present again in person, because that would be amazing.
Thank you so much, Mikki. Thank you for inviting me to your show. It was really fun.
All right, team, hopefully you enjoyed that as much as I did. You can tell he's such a great guy. He's so generous with his information, and he's super genuine about people reaching out and chatting to him about all things metabolic health, and I certainly recommend his books. Next week on the podcast, I have the pleasure of chatting to Stephen Guyenet, who has written a book, The Hungry Brain, and we talk all about the role of the brain in terms of weight management. Until then, though, team, you can catch me over on Facebook at Mikki Williden Nutrition, over on Instagram and Twitter at Mikki Williden, or head along to my website, Mikkiwilliden.com, sign up to my recipe portal access, that's $12 a month, to get a bunch of recipes, my emails, access to the private Facebook group. It is awesome. I actually just put a French toast recipe up, or any one of my meal plans, or book a consultation. That's Mikkiwilliden.com. All right, team, you have a great day. Talk next week. See ya.